Hello, I'm Joan Leach. I'm Professor and Director of an Australian National Centre for the Public Awareness of Science, and my task at the moment is to give you a bit of a field guide to persuasion in science communication. And actually, this topic is what got me into the field a very long time ago. I found as a science student, I was probably a little bit more fascinated in the way my lecturers argued with each other than I was in what was going on in the lab. And so that sort of inspired me to find out a little bit more about this, how scientists argued with each other, how they persuaded each other of these crazy things they believe. And then I guess the natural progression was to think about how they persuaded others. So I came at this from looking at persuasion inside science, how scientists talk to each other, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But then this bigger question about how science persuades others. Now, this is a huge body of research. So what I've prepared here is a bit of a field guide. You know, this field guide to birds, this is field guide to persuasion. And I'm going to go through three of the kind of dominant theories that science communication plays with when we talk about persuasion, okay? The way I've organized this is, you'll see the slides behind me. You'll notice that some terms are highlighted yellow. And that just strikes me that it might be bad for people who are colorblind, but if you see a little bit of a gray streak, that might be good enough. But those terms are kind of terms of art that get bandied about in science communication. And these are terms that, because this is just an introduction, a field guide, if you will, if you want to read more about those terms, they're easily found in the science communication literature. Okay, so these are the kind of things you can go deeper on. All right. So let's kick off. I'm dividing this into kind of three major topics. I want to talk about the science of science communication. Maybe that's a little something you've heard about. That's been popular for about the last 10 years. I want to talk about framing theory. And I'm also going to talk a little bit at the very end about rhetorical theory. Now, the differences between these might seem subtle at first, but I think you'll get what the differences are as I go along. So the science of science communication tends to draw very heavily on the field of psychology or social psychology. So I'll talk through that. Then I'm going to go to framing theory, which has kind of emerged out of the discipline of sociology. So it sees persuasion in science just a little bit differently. And finally, rhetorical theory, which is a way of which we might be able to synthesize some of these ideas from both looking at things as individuals from the psychological literature to looking at things from societies or cultures, which is more from the sociological literature. All right, so here we go, a field guide. What do these birds look like? Okay, from the point of view of science communication, we typically grasp that by looking at three particular things. That is, the science of science communication looks at three aspects of the persuasion process and kind of focuses mostly on those. Now, some people see this as a problem, that it's so focused, but actually it's a bit of a benefit because it can target our understanding of what's going on in persuasion. So if you see this as a limited approach, that's okay. It is, but it helps us to focus in on three, I would argue, particular things. So as human beings, we have attitudes, we have behaviors, and we make choices. And from the point of view of the science of science communication, those are the important features we look at when we're talking about persuasion. So, and we can look at these as domains in which we can intervene and domains we can understand. So for example, attitude studies in science communication. They are myriad, okay? So it's been incredibly popular, say in the last 15 years or so, to have a look at particular segments of the population's attitudes toward a particular science or technology. The idea is, once you understand the attitudes of this group, you can intervene in those attitudes. You can persuade people that they might choose to believe something else, okay? Similarly, we have behaviors, okay? And sometimes we want to intervene in those behaviors. And finally, choices and decision-making. That's this other domain. All right, so let's go back. Attitudes. So one of the ways we study attitudes is by so-called segmenting audiences. All right, so we segment up these audiences, we package them up, and we say, gosh, what is the post-millennial attitude toward new apps that go on third-generation phones? We can get very, very specific in what small groups think about very specific things, okay? What that allows us to do as science communicators then is to target messages toward those audiences. Now, if you say to yourself, gosh, that sounds a lot like marketing and advertising, I say to you, yes. And that's probably the sector of practice that has been most successful with this kind of mode of working. However, if we think about some of science communication as so-called social marketing, that is that we're enticing audiences to change their attitudes about science and technology, whether that's GM or maybe their attitudes toward nanotechnology. There's all kinds of things that we can do. By segmenting and targeting messages, we can be very effective in persuasion. So that's an entire approach to thinking about how persuasion happens. And there's some people who spend most of their career just segmenting and targeting messages, okay? Now, there's another segment of people from the science of science communication point of view that is really not targeting just attitudes, but they want to target behavior, okay? And there are two really dominant theories at the moment that kind of use this approach of targeting behavior. The first one moves between the notion that people have attitudes and that attitudes influence behavior, and that science communicators can kind of get in there, and that's called the theory of planned behavior. And it goes pretty much like it says on the tin. I have an intention, I have an attitude, and that attitude is then going to give me an idea of what I might do next, what my behaviors might be. Now, the place where this really comes in, right, is when you think about conservation messages, and where it really came to the fore about 20 years ago was in areas of recycling. I want to be a better citizen. I have an attitude about how important it is to our culture. I form an intention. Gosh, I really do need to do something about my waste, my energy consumption. What can I do? A communicator comes sliding in with an answer and says, hey, you know what you can do? You can recycle. Okay, so I have an intention, I have an attitude, and it becomes a behavior. So one of the things that science communicators in the science of science communication tradition have done is to go and look at the ways in which these attitudes form intentions and how many of them actually lead to behaviors. Now, the bad news is very few. However, the dream is still alive that if we can impact people, that is, change their attitudes towards something, and help them form different kinds of intentions, then their behaviors will kind of come out the other end, right? Very important theory of persuasion. Jury's out on which cases it works. It does tend to work in these cases where you can give people very concrete things to do, like recycle. Okay, I can divide my rubbish up into two piles. You make it easy for me. I'm persuaded. Okay, where things are a little bit trickier, of course, is in complicated behaviors. So it's keeping with the kind of energy example. Well, you know, I'd like to be a good citizen. I would like to reduce my energy footprint. Well, which car should I buy? And people come in with all their information, and it becomes very confusing very fast. And, you know, my intention wasn't really to spend a lot of time on this or to spend a lot of money. And now there's all these other kind of features coming in here. And, oh, I don't know, I'm just going to go buy a car. So as things become more complex, this theory of planned behavior seems not to be able to be borne out as much as people might like. But it's something you should have a look at, theory of planned behavior, because it's a way of explaining how people get persuaded to actually do things differently, their behaviors. Okay, another approach to behavior is so-called nudge theory, okay? And this one has gained a whole bunch of traction in the last, say, 10 to 15 years because the UK government invested in it very heavily. And they have a very famous, go ahead and Google it, nudge unit that allows people to kind of change their behavior without having to form any elaborate intentions, to get in there where places where they may not even have attitudes. The canonical example of this is, you know, at the end of kind of long forms, long government forms, at the end it can say, would you give $1, you know, to help somebody in need? So you fill in the form, you're kind of going along, you're doing your day-to-day stuff. $1 to give somebody who's hungry? Sure, tick. Okay? The idea is you can nudge behavior by making it very, very simple for people to perform an action where they did not have an attitude or intention previously. So that's very different than kind of the opposite of the theory of planned behavior. Okay? So you're actually persuading somebody to do something because you're making it easy. It's a little tick box on the end of a form. It's the kind of things that make you feel a little bit guilty about doing something. It's the very simple ideas about putting your waste bins, right, in places that are easy to distribute your recycling versus food waste, whatever. You don't give people a choice, you just nudge them into the right behavior. Okay, so it's another way that the science of science communication is kind of taken on persuasion. How might we take some of these ideas of making things easy for people, nudging them into the right behaviors, without having to give them a lot of information? So that's an interesting idea for science communication. It's actually not about the information, but actually the design of the persuasion itself. And finally, in the sort of big theory of science communication, I could target choice. Okay? So I can look at the information that is kind of supporting different kinds of decision making, and as a science communicator, I could kind of focus on that, right? What choices are people making? And that's where I go. I don't want to change all of their attitudes about science. I just care about one. Back to the climate change example. So for example, we know that it's very, very hard to shift overall attitudes about a big area, for example, like climate change, right? That's a Herculean effort. You're going to have to persuade people of a lot, maybe to change a lot of the attitudes they have. But what if you didn't have to just change their attitudes, you just had to change their decision-making about one thing, right? Back to recycling. I don't care if you believe in climate change. The argument might go, I don't care if you believe in, I'm not trying to change your attitude. I'm not, if you think humans aren't causing it, fine. All I'm asking you to do is to divide your rubbish up like this because it's easier for local processing areas to kind of do the recycling and get rid of your waste fast, and that's just kind of better for your community, okay? So this notion that actually what you need to do is focus on persuading people to independent decisions instead of trying to change all of their attitudes, okay? So these have been the kind of predominant theories that have guided a lot of thinking about persuasion towards the public in relation to science. Now, gosh, you think, well, good, if I could do that, if I could segment everybody up, if I knew everything, I could segment everybody up, figure out their attitudes, figure out what their intentions are, impact their behavior, and if none of that works, well, heck, I can at least support their decision making. You kind of think, well, some of that's got to work, right? Well, a little bit of an issue. It's not as easy as we thought because as humans, we are poor reasoners. So the story goes, okay? And so we have these things that are so-called cognitive biases, and these just get in our way. So even if we try to treat people like they're rational, after we segment them and target their intentions and their behavior and their decision-making, we're still probably going to fail because we are poor reasoners, and we have these things called cognitive biases. And so what we really have to look at then, once we get to this mode of thinking about persuasion, is we got to think about what are the things that are impacting people from making the right decisions, even if they have the best information, intentions, and we know what their attitudes are. Okay? So what are those things? Well, there are many of these sorts of graphs and charts that live on the internet. This is one I pulled off that list our cognitive biases. Some psychologists have managed to count about 150 of these. Okay? So these are things, what kind of cognitive biases are these? Well, these are things like outcome bias, bandwagon bias. We get a little bit tired when people tell us too much information. We just kind of shut down. Selection bias, anchoring effects, right? We'll always tend to go back to what we already know, right? New information is really hard to seep in. Primacy and recency effects. We tend to believe the things that we're told first and last. This is just humans being poor reasoners. Now, the problem here is that because there are so many of these so-called biases, it's very, very difficult to persuade people, right? And so you can spend some time looking at these biases. And from the science of science communication approach, your next step is to say, well, if people have these biases, how then do we correct them? Okay? So much of science communication on this way of understanding persuasion is that people are poor reasoners, and we've got to get beyond these cognitive biases by correcting them. So we point out to people things like, oh, did you know, you tend to kind of remember and believe the things you hear first and last. Be careful with that, okay? So it becomes a kind of corrective, right, of telling people, ooh, beware. And there are a myriad of books in science communication that talk about this, okay? How to be a better reasoner. And if you think of like the think fast, think slow kind of arguments that have been made, a number of popular science books kind of delve into this way of thinking, that it's really about correcting these cognitive biases to help you make better decisions, to get back to the science of science communication that I just spoke about. So, can we correct all these things? I don't know. Certain people are certainly trying. Or what you do is you can use some of these things, right, to persuade on behalf of, science, on behalf of the true and the good. So you use things like primacy and recency effects to underscore your message and to take away from somebody else's. So it's a bit of a strategic question there for science communication. Okay, so that's a bit of an overview of the science of science communication, the heartland of what we call ABC: attitudes, behavior, and choice. Okay? Now I want to move on a little bit because there's another way of thinking about persuasion. And I won't spend quite as long on this one, but it's moving from this idea that persuasion is about changing someone's mind, right, as a kind of a psychological problem. That's mostly what science of science communication is focused on. But now it's not so much about changing your mind, but changing the way you see or interpret, or the way that meaning is kind of presented in the world. And so this way of thinking about persuasion has really gained a huge amount of traction. And if you look at the journals in science communication, so the Journal of Science Communication, the Journal of Science Communication, Public Understanding of Science, many articles in there will be in there, and they'll be talking about framing effects. So I want you to just have a little bit of familiarity with what we're talking about when we say something is framed, okay? So the key question here is, are we persuaded by the message, or are we persuaded by the context? Now the answer obviously is both. However, when we're thinking about this in terms of framing, we're focusing a little bit more on the context, kind of like when you go into a gallery and you see this amazing portrait, and you stop and you look at it, you kind of step back and you think, yeah, that is an amazing portrait. But then you start to notice that the frame around the portrait is doing a lot of work, right? It kind of orients the portrait in a very particular way. It's perhaps an ornate frame that allows you to understand this portrait as something from a past time, maybe 19th century, where they favored such ornate frames. And it gives you a lot of information. It helps you interpret and understand the meaning of the portrait. Well, like that, this idea of framing in science communication has kind of come about to kind of develop this idea that context is essential to understanding how persuasion happens. All right? I made a little joke here. There's a noble lineage, right, in the sense of a Nobel Prize winner, Tversky, who won a Nobel Prize for basically pointing this out, that what we know is frame dependent. Okay? So you can be given the same information, but if it's given in a slightly different context, we will see it as a completely different bit of information. Okay, so he won a Nobel Prize from that. But there's another lineage here coming out of sociology from the sociologist Erving Goffman, who also noticed this issue of framing effects. Okay, his point was that, like when you're in the gallery, right, frames work best when you don't notice them at all, right? You don't see them coming. Right? You think the portrait is gorgeous, you really admire it, but you never quite notice it. The frame, it's helping you appreciate the picture. And so he says Goffman's point was that a lot of our persuasion is hidden, and it's hidden in these frames. So a couple years ago, a communication journalism scholar in the United States, Matthew Nisbet, kind of picked up this idea and really ran with it for science communication. And he gives this kind of snappy definition of framing. He says, frames are interpretive storylines that set a specific train of thought in motion, communicating why an issue might be a problem, who might be responsible for it, and what should be done about it. Okay? And this has really inspired a lot of research into how different kinds of science get framed. Okay? Now, I'll just briefly introduce a few, not all, of some of the frames that he points out. Okay, so he has a typology of framing in his article called Framing Science Communication, or Framing Science, I believe it's just called Framing Science. And one of the things he starts with is how much science is framed in the public mind as social progress. And in fact, what's really interesting to me, as somebody who's worked with scientists over 30 years now, is that whenever you ask a researcher to talk about their work, they tend to start by saying things like, well, this work is really important, and it's really important because it's good for society. Yeah? And here's how it's good for society. And they'll start drilling down into why that's the case. And so it's almost a knee-jerk response now that in order for science to be good or accepted, it has to be in the service of social progress. So you find like some researchers, for example, quantum physicists, really struggling to figure out what the social progress narrative is for their area of science, because it might be a little bit more basic. So social progress is one of those frames, Nisbet says, that becomes almost, it's just part of the picture of how we persuade people that science is a good thing, right? It's leading to social progress. However, what he points out is if you start to pick away at that, oh really, right? Is it so progressive? Who's it progressive for? Which part of society benefits? That narrative kind of crumbles very quickly, and so the frame becomes a little bit difficult. He points out that there are a number of other frames that are important to convincing people of the merit and the worth of particular areas of science and science in general. Economic development and competitiveness, okay? So I mentioned the quantum physicist just a moment ago. Well, we're in the middle of a quantum race, right? A race for quantum advantage. Which country is going to come up with the first quantum computer that basically can freeze everyone out in terms of cryptography, right? Who's going to have the code that nobody can break, all right? So this is a huge deal. But all of that science gets framed, and its legitimacy gets framed around economic development and international competitiveness. Now, of course, this frame can be questioned too. You start picking away at that, and you think, well, wait a minute, isn't this just like a new Cold War? Is that what we want? Is that that's what we want out of science? That makes it good? And wait a minute, this is just a different kind of a form of nationalism, right? So these frames can all be queried, they can be broken down, but it takes a minute, right? Because the information is all packaged within that frame. Uncertainty is another frame. Opening Pandora's box, we certainly know that from sort of genetics arguments and thinking about recent work with CRISPR. How far do we want to go with this science before we're going to do something we can't turn back, we can't put back in the box, right? It's a way of introducing science that is inherently persuasive, okay? And some of these narratives are very pro-science, some are a little bit more questioning, but the frames are the ones that give us the persuasive power of what science is good or not so good for, okay? So that gives you a little bit of an idea about framing and why it's become so important, okay? Because Tversky, that Nobel Prize winner, and also Goffman argued, there's no information that comes to you without a frame. And the most persuasive frames are the ones you don't see. So finally, and probably, the sort of approach that I'm most identified with and the one I get most excited about, so hold on, is rhetorical approaches to science. Now, what do I mean by rhetorical? Well, it's a very long tradition, goes all the way back to sort of the earliest philosophy in the Western tradition, to Aristotle and before, to the sophists. And it's an argument that's about, well, where does persuasion come from? Well, according to this tradition, persuasion does come from individuals. There are psychological aspects of it. It happens within a culture, and so we have to care about all these things that I just mentioned, for example, like framing. But also, we can intervene into it. And so it's this kind of a worldview, if you will, that persuasion is happening around us all the time, and that we are basically persuasive rhetorical actors at every moment. Okay? Now, the one person who's made this argument the best in relation to science is the biologist Peter Medawar, who pointed out that just about everything written in science, and especially the scientific paper, is a lie. He called it a lie. I would just say it's persuasive. And that's because it reconfigures, it presents a world that actually didn't happen, right? So the scientific paper, and you'll know this from if you ever have even written a scientific report for a lab report in school. Gee, what happens? Well, let's see, there's a literature, and we stand on the shoulders of giants, and we look in this literature, and we think, gosh, what an interesting array of questions. From that literature, I come up with a question. I have a hypothesis. I will go and test this hypothesis. And as I test this hypothesis, I will learn a method. And this method will help me test my hypothesis and give me my data, and the data falls out lovely from the method, which then I will now analyze. Wonder what happened here. I see. And in my discussion, all will become clear, and I will answer my hypothesis. Now, I don't think I need to point out to you, and Medawar actually wrote a beautiful book about it, pointing out that this is not how science unfolds, okay? But that's how we reconstruct it. And why do we reconstruct it that way? And this is why I got interested in persuasion in the first place, because it's persuasive, to make it seem like one thing logically falls out of the next. And so some of the things I've been interested in is how that logic follows. All right, so if you're interested in this, I've got a picture here of a nice Janus-faced vessel. You care about two different things, right? You care about the means of persuasion. That is, what means of persuasion does anyone have in order to persuade someone else? And you also care about using those means of persuasion to be persuasive yourself, okay? And that's what makes the rhetorical project a little bit different from some of the other academic projects that you might see. So you can study this from a number of perspectives. But if you do this, there's a sort of a typography, if you will, of things that you should care about in persuasion, whether it's science or anything else, okay? You care about how people come up with their ideas, okay? And that's not so far from this theory of framing, that we come up with our ideas within a context, and that's a context of rhetorical invention, right? How do we come up with the thoughts we have? How do I try to persuade you to believe what I believe? Well, that's within a series of tools that I have to invent ideas. And this might sound a little bit funny, inventing ideas, but that's a very, very old notion in Western culture, that ideas have to come from somewhere else, okay? And so some people have the idea they come from our heads, from our brains. Other people say that no, ideas are just kind of around us and we pick them up as we go. But the rhetorical ideas, they probably come from both us and the context. And what we do, and for someone to be truly persuasive and rhetorically masterful, is they're able to kind of mash up what comes from the context and what comes from their head in new and unique ways. Okay, so there's always an element of surprise. So if you're going to study invention, right, you're quite interested in where scientists get their ideas from, and also where publics get their ideas from. Again, not so far away from this idea of studying attitudes and segmentation. Where do people get their ideas from? So that makes it possible for me to persuade them. So you care about rhetorical invention. That's one thing you care about from a rhetorical point of view. You care about how people organize their ideas. Okay, again, remember I mentioned one of those biases was the primacy and the recency effect. They have real import, right? How people come to their ideas in a system of organization. Or like Medawar, we organize the scientific paper to make it seem like it's absolutely logically, I mean, you need to come to this conclusion. You come to no other conclusion. Although we know that scientific papers are retracted and all kinds of other things. So there's, that link is not fail-safe, right? But how you organize your ideas also makes them persuasive. Style, where it comes to personal style or intellectual style or style of presentation, right? So it's different communicating, I mean, this is not hard. It's different communicating science on TikTok than it is in a lecture, right? And so, but the style has really important effects on how it is we see something as persuasive and compelling. And I would say that TikTok has the advantage that it can persuade without you ever seeing it coming. Whereas in other face-to-face interactions, we're always kind of wondering, what's your angle? What are you trying to tell me? So again, kind of like that framing story. Memory, and here I don't mean that you've got to memorize things. What I'm talking about is a sense of cultural memory and the way in which memory is kind of manipulated or changed or affected to be persuasive. And of course, in science, science has a very, very short memory. So you don't cite to things, what, 3 or 5 years more than 3 or 5 years prior. And so science has a very short memory, and so scientific change happens like in this window. And so what's really interesting to me is people can go back into scientific history and dig out new ideas as a pattern of invention, perhaps, and present them as if they're kind of new, and nobody will remember. So looking at the way in which memory is kind of manipulated is really important to understanding persuasion. Yeah. And finally, the way that things are delivered. And we know in relation to science, there's been some really great studies about how even children who have been growing up as sort of digital natives are still suspicious when their science teacher gives them a science experiment to do online. This is really interesting. There's been a recent study that says kids who love to live their entire lives online, they're given an experiment to perform, and they said, no, that's not a real experiment. Modeling on a screen is not a real experiment. That's actually not finding out what the world is like, right? So it's interesting the way and the mode in which things are delivered can have huge persuasive effects. Okay, so these are 3, as you can say, sweeping, dominant ways of thinking about persuasion in relation to science. And you can spend, weeks, months, maybe even years, delving into any one of these ways of considering science. And of course, there's other issues that we need to think about too. I actually think the useful thing is comparing some of these methods to see what they do well and what they don't do well. So obviously, focusing on attitudes, behaviors, and choice helps you understand individuals. Focusing on framing might help you understand science in the media, right? And focusing on rhetorical action might help you make some connections between both of them. I think there's more persuasion inside science than is usually mentioned or usually talked about. So there's a sense in which when we talk about persuasion, it's usually about scientists persuading others. But I think probably understanding persuasion in science starts at home, inside science. So I think that's an area that needs a lot more work about how scientists persuade each other and then go out and persuade others. And finally, I think there's an ethics here that is worth thinking about. In each ways of these thinking about persuasion, how do we acknowledge others' attitudes and ideas and views and opinions as being legitimate, something we should care about, respect? And how much of persuasion is morally justified, and how much of it is just people trying to persuade others to think like them. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Joan. I want to do like your lecturers did. Those moments when you're seeing the lecturers talk to each other, as opposed to hearing them discourse one by themselves. Now we get to pull apart the things that you were just saying. Yep. And the place that I wanted to start is, of course, with the word persuasion. And it's something, I've got I think it's an emotional question for you in a second, and we'll come to that one in a bit. But the first one is, it's a framing of the word persuasion. Do you take persuasion to be a pejorative term? Or is it a term that you resist the pejorative labels around? Or do you wish people would not just take persuasion as pejorative? Where do you sit when someone says, oh, that's just persuasion, that's a bad thing?
So I think persuasion is trying to describe what happens. I mean, it's a descriptor, right? Yeah. It's a descriptive thing. Some communication is giving people information, although I'd say that, because I take that rhetorical view, that's also persuasion.
But nothing is not.
Nothing is not persuasive. So what you're pointing to is you're talking about an element of communication, which is how people interact. Yeah. And it's sort of like, think like me. Come on. I know you want to think like me. And so I think it's just describing what happens. I mean, the rhetorical word's an interesting one, right? Because it's usually
as in the word
rhetorical. Yeah. So people say, oh, I wish we'd stop that rhetoric and really get on with it. As if, do you know what I mean? As if rhetoric is something, that we could get on with, though. Yeah. So I don't think it's a pejorative word. I think it's a descriptor. Persuasion is a descriptor of basically saying, hey, think like me. And we do it all the time. And then the interesting question, how does science play in that space?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, and I guess this is where I'm going with the emotional question, in the sense that I listened to what you were just talking about. And I wonder, learning this stuff, does it give you the tools to resist persuasion, or does it give you the tools to use persuasion? Or do you ever get freedom from persuasion?
So, well, the short answer is no. But there's a lovely long tradition of thinking about this. So, and that's why I'm attracted to the rhetorical tradition, because the idea was from Aristotle that you need to study persuasion, find those means of persuasion, because your job is to be persuasive.
Yep.
Okay. Now, all right. If you stop there, I think you've got some ethical issues, but very few people stop there. Okay, so if you think about, well, from the Greeks, you go to the Latins, and the Latins thought, well, what is a good citizen? A good citizen is the just man speaking well, right?
Okay,
and being persuasive.
Yeah.
Well, it meant being persuasive within the context of a series of rules about how to be a good citizen. And I think that's really interesting. And so, I mean, okay, so let's kind of update that by a couple thousand years and say, well, what does it mean for us to be good users of persuasion around science? Okay, so scientists would say, well, you just got to speak the truth.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Yeah, good luck with that. Well, I mean, you just got to tell people the truth. Other people say, no, there's more to scientific persuasion than that. And that's where you start getting into these other theories. That actually, to be a just persuader, I have to respect where you come from. I got to respect your attitude, your existing attitudes to some degree, while saying,
So
I respect your attitudes, but think like me.
So a just persuader would not attempt to change someone's cultural beliefs? Well, what things would they say?
Well, see, this is it. Well, because you have to have a very particular view of science, right? The thing is, if you think that science is outside of culture, it's just an add-on. Doesn't really,
many scientists
as many scientists do. So it doesn't matter what your culture is. I'm just giving you some science on top of that. Now, a lot of people would disagree and say, well, actually, no, there's a bit of Western culture baked into science. Yep. And so really by presenting science in a particular way, I'm going after some of your core beliefs.
Indeed.
But, some of the great stuff is the way in which, vaccination is a great example. So some of the most successful large-scale vaccine stuff, thinking about smallpox or those sorts of examples, are when it's okay to get the smallpox vaccine on a Thursday in September because the moon is kind of in the right position. Now, in that sense, right? I get the vaccine. I believe the vaccine works. That's awesome. But you didn't have to really disrupt all of my other, metaphysics about the moon and everything else in order to do that. So there's some great examples where you can see persuasion kind of working a little bit, but not going in.
So isn't this, and I know the other stance question that I wanted to pull apart here is that of the bodies of theory that you've discussed just now, science of science communication, framing theory, and rhetorical theory, that you would have a leaning towards one of those that you like. Science of science communication would not be your baby.
It's not my baby.
It's not your baby. But the form of persuasion that you just described there, that on a certain Thursday it's okay. That's science of science communication. Isn't that what they're saying?
No. I mean,
segment people.
No.
Understand.
Okay. No. Let's take this example though, and let's pick it apart from the three different.
Cool. Yeah, that's fine.
Because I think that's the trick here. It isn't that any one of these theories it's got the whole deal.
Okay.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah, sure.
All right. So if we look at this example of persuading people to vaccinate. All right. Now we can take the science of science communication view, and what do we do then, Will? If we take the science and science,
we understand their demographics.
Attitude, their attitudes, their behavior, and their choice.
Yep.
So
I always thought ABC was always be selling.
Oh yeah. Well, see, never mind. All right. So let's look at vaccination. So we look at people's attitudes.
Yep.
And we know that, for example, amongst women in the North Shore of Sydney, their attitudes towards vaccination are hesitant.
Yep, sure.
All right, so then we look at their behaviors. Well, we notice that vaccination amongst that group is low.
Yeah, sure.
And so what we need to do is we need to go after their choices. All right. So, and that's your persuasive kind of hierarchy.
And then you could nudge in there somehow.
You could nudge. That's right. You could nudge them, right? You could make it.
Do your vaccination while you're picking up something else.
That's exactly right. Or do your vaccination in relation to your child care.
Yeah.
And that's been a very strong nudge. Okay, but then let's look at vaccination from the point of view of framing. Okay, so how is vaccination predominantly framed in Australian culture? Let's just think about this for a minute.
Well, as doing something for the public good.
Doing something for the public good. Well, that's great. Somebody else can do something for the public good, not me.
And I will free ride. I'm going to happily free ride on this one.
And I don't need to, because I live in an area where none of these
Absolutely.
Whooping cough, not here.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a legitimate problem if we're framing it this way.
Exactly.
Free riders have to exist.
So how can we reframe it? How can we reframe that from being about the public good to something else?
I guess people would then say, they'd say herd immunity, that we need a certain percentage to get to that public good. We need to get to 85, 90%, 95% of people vaccinated to get to that, and we know that those last 5% are immunocompromised.
Yep. Okay. Or let's reframe a little bit more and say, well, okay, no, it's not for your immediate family, but think of your grandparents. Mm-hmm. There's a resurgence of whooping cough. Yep. And it's going to help. It's going to go after the baby. Yep. Right? So do it, even if you're not going to do it for yourself or for your older children, you need to do it for the baby, or you need to do it for grandma. Okay? So you reframe. And so from that point of view, it's not about necessarily going the ABC route. Mm-hmm. It's talking about the way in which you're okay. Now let's go about this from a rhetorical point of view. Okay? So what are the means of persuasion we have when we're talking to people about vaccination? What do we have at our disposal?
So you draw on what they value, draw on what they care about, maybe logic.
Logic, yeah, identity.
Yep.
Okay, all of those sorts of things, right? So I've got quite a few tools up my sleeve when we're talking about vaccination and how I might target people. Okay, so, right, now using those 5 things, inventions, like what do I have? Okay, so you can try logic. Yeah. So there's a sense in which in vaccination only 0.0001
snoozeworthy, but sure, someone might be convinced of that.
Somebody might. Okay, so you can use logic as a form of invention. What else can you use? Analogy. You can sort of just go through the tools at your disposal and think about how it's going to work. So you kind of open yourself up to a wider, seeing persuasion as a wide field of play. Yeah. So the thing that I think is important is being able to kind of flip back and forth between these 3 things. Sure. And there's other theories of persuasion as well. And seeing what kind of falls out of them that's different than the one prior.
So in a sense, if someone is going in to persuade, these 3 ways of thinking about it will all be supportive and beneficial if you're attempting to persuade people.
Exactly. But you can see people who take one. Yeah. Right? That it's about bias. It's about the fact that you're not very smart, Will Grant.
Sure, I don't doubt that.
And so, it's about I'm gonna manipulate around your biases, and that's what I'm gonna spend my time doing. That's the thing that kind of drives me a little bit nuts. It's like, well, okay, fine, but you're gonna miss out a lot of other.
I can understand that pushing at the science communication there to become reductionist to the point of there will be one myopic explanation of this. If we can solve that problem, then we will rectify that. But there are so many reasons.
And on the other hand, because I am drawn very much to rhetorical theory, one of the problems with it, though, is if you think persuasion is happening all the time with everybody, you become a little bit cynical. And I have been accused. I have been accused on occasion of being a bit. What's your game? You're kind of what was called in the 1970s and 80s as a hermeneutics of suspicion. This idea that you always have to be suspicious about who's trying to convince you of what at any one moment. And maybe I am a little bit like that because I'm attracted to that rhetorical, the worldview really.
Isn't and I don't know who was arguing this, but the Greeks or the Romans saying that there is just persuasion. Isn't there an element of there that recognizing that there will be good faith arguments and people are not always agenda driven?
Well, that's right. And look, I mean, there is, absolutely good faith arguments, but also arguments that hold water because they have evidence. I know that sounds very old-fashioned, but there are arguments that you can give a wide range of evidence for, and there are arguments that you just can't.
Yeah, sure.
So, and that's in here too. It's not just that you're, framing for some nefarious reason, right?
And we, as humans, we're also not troubled by the fact that there are arguments all the time. There's attempting to persuade each other all the time of different things, but mostly we sit within legitimate argument. Yeah, we're not going to. Janie and I were buying a new fridge on the weekend, and there was a conversation about the colour of fridge.
A conversation, was there?
Yeah, we got to a point. It's like, okay, it's this fridge. What colour does it come in? And no one's going to dial down to, okay, it's going to be a divorce if I don't get the colour of fridge.
I don't know.
I'm sure there might, but there's boundaries. There's boundaries, and in some senses, yes, we might persuade if we get the black or the white or the silver, but there's only so many legitimate arguments that don't cause other problems. So even if we are trying to persuade each other all the time, nobody is too troubled by that.
No, well, I don't know. I mean, argument is seen to be kind of a bad word.
Sure.
Right? And if we look at the way in which, I can't be the only one who's noticed this, Will. If we look at the way in which, for example, political debate and political argumentation has been happening, some of it's been pretty evidence-free zone. And name calling. I mean, come on. I mean, you hear my accent. There have been certain leaders that just call people names. I mean, there's no content to the argument. It's just name calling.
Wasn't it always this way? Like I want to ask the question. This is moving into like a political history, but I do. In the history of rhetoric, really, I guess.
Name calling's always been there. But I think the point is, though, this is back to the good person speaking well, or even the good researcher, the good researcher communicating well. And it's about your orientation and what the norms are, right? This is the other thing that I think this is one of
the norms of rhetoric within
the rhetoric. Yeah, that's right. The norms of rhetoric within that space. Now those do shift over time. So yes, it may have been always thus, but I think our norms have shifted recently in a very particular way, quite dramatically. And so things that you couldn't say 10 years ago are just flying off people's tongues, right? I mean, that's pretty amazing. Well, for science too. Right? I mean, there's a sense in which, science has entered into politics in a way that you might not have expected in the, 10, 15 years ago. So, so I think those norms shift, and understanding that is also part of the rhetorical worldview, is understanding those norms and how you're going to get in there and work with those.
The example of that pops up instantly for me in the way that the rhetoric of science or around science or of scientists has changed is the happiness of scientists in using emotions in certain spaces, so not in a journal paper, and probably not in a conference presentation, but definitely in their public work, and definitely in the sort of semi-public work that is like articles on the conversational stuff, where they're definitely talking about their work, but very much more free at putting their emotions in that you wouldn't have seen 15 years ago.
Yep, and talking about the meaning, looking at public meanings of what they're doing, and again, kind of drifting now to thinking a bit about framing, right? And the frames in which they want to present their work. I think like social progress, like being relevant to certain kinds of social issues, grand challenges, that grand challenge kind of rhetoric that that's really popular at the moment. Oh, grand challenge, who could be against that, right? Got to solve it. How
do our students, all of our students, stay at the front of where you can be inventive on rhetoric, the things you can do, and what boundaries are too far to push? How do you think about that sort of thing?
So I think actually, and this is where I'm a hopeless academic, but that's why I like to put these things in terms of starting with the kind of approach you have to persuasion, instead of just going out there and, catching persuasion in the wild. There's a sense in which I think you always have to be asking yourself, wait a minute, okay, what's my standpoint on this? What are the tools at my disposal? How do I analyze this? How is this persuasion actually working? Who's it directed to? All that kind of stuff, right? And so it's a kind of a constant vigilance around public argumentation and not just taking people's word for it. And I think there's a lot of taking people's word for it when it comes to science, or not taking people's word for it, where expert is a bad, that's right, it's very bimodal, right? But that middle path, right? Where you kind of say, okay, give me your evidence and I'll start thinking about how you put that together, and then I'll see if I want to believe it or not.
Look, there would be certainly topics which many of us in the pro-science world would be careful about having conversations about, whilst there may be strong debate within the sciences about different aspects. But we'd be careful about having that debate in public because it seemed to be transgressing from tribal allegiances.
Yeah, I think that's right. And GM's probably the best example, and it's still the case. It is absolutely still the case that I think you can have very different arguments inside science than you can have in public around genetic modification, CRISPR and the like.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's in multiple domains, right? Human research, agricultural research. Yeah, no, I think that's right.
I guess the final question that I just wanted to ask then is if scientists are changing in their readiness to cope with persuasion, what is the pathway of that from? Why would scientists have been resistant to persuasion previously, but now are more ready for it, or are they not?
That's such a complicated question. So look, I think there are norms around persuasion inside science. There are norms, and interestingly, those are changing too, right? And we've seen this huge rash of retractions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And those norms, I think that norm shift is actually indicative of that, about how scientists persuade each other and what evidence they need. The question for me is, and I want to say that the norms around science public interactions have also shifted, and we do see evidence that scientists are more willing to try out a little persuasion of the public. However, I also think that some of those contexts are becoming more high risk.
Totally.
So you know what I mean? Like so those norms, the norms are just shifting. So it's like, yes, I want to give this a go, but if I fail, you lose your job, right? I mean, so I think understanding that context is really important. Understanding how persuasion is working with science, and what scientists are willing to say, because I think that risk profile is there. Yeah.
I think it's always fascinating that you can be surely in any moment of persuasion creative. That there are so many more tools beyond the norms that are available to you.
Absolutely.
And each of those bears risk. Further further away from the norms, they get riskier and riskier and riskier.
Yeah.
But I do agree. It's fascinating that that window of what is usable now has shifted, but hasn't broken. There's still some sort of window there.
Yeah.
Fantastic. What then are you persuaded of? What persuades you?
What persuades me? Well, look, I mean, I think I'm probably just about like anybody else, although I think I might be a little bit more reflective on what's working at any moment. I like to think that I'm persuaded by evidence, but I also know that I'm persuaded by emotion, right? Pathos, good pathos always gets me. I'm a tearjerker.
It's almost like emotions work.
It's almost like emotions work, right?
For most people.
That's right. Yeah. So emotional persuasion, for sure. Credibility, and I wouldn't think of myself as a very credulous person, but credibility is really important to me. I work in the academy, right? And what do we do here? We try to hand out credibility.
Yep.
And so I'm probably, perhaps at my peril, maybe I'm even a little bit more credulous of the kinds of academic credibility that there is, because this is where I work and I respect it and all that kind of thing. That's right. So I worry about that a little bit, but I might be a little credulous about expertise, but I think it probably does. So expertise, emotions, evidence, and sometimes, when you're tired and you've had a bad day, and whatever's going to make your life easy, right? Yeah. And that's where I think the science of science communication is got something going on, right? There are heuristics that we use when we're tired, had enough, and you just take a little bit of an intellectual shortcut, and you think, well, look, I know Will, he wouldn't lie to me. Yeah. So it's just because he's just told me something so remarkable, I can't hardly believe it. That's okay. All right, I'm going to go for it, right? Yeah. So.
All right. Thank you so much, Joan.
You're welcome.
That's fascinating stuff.
Thanks.